Hi guys, last week we were analysing and solving multiplication problems. This week we're going to move on to fractions, and today we're concentrating on creating and identifying fractions. I'd like you to consider the following statements and decide whether you agree or disagree with each of them. To begin with, we've got Rocket, and you can see there he's got a sandwich and he splits that sandwich into two parts, and he's saying, I have cut the sandwich into two parts, I have made halves. Then we've got Peter, and he's got a bar of chocolate and he splits that into four parts, and he's saying, I have cut the chocolate bar into four parts, I have made quarters. And finally we've got Gamora, and she's got a pizza and she's going to split that pizza into 8 parts, and she's saying, I have cut the pizza into 8 parts, I have made eighths. With a partner, I want you to consider each of those statements and decide whether you agree or disagree with each of them. So pause the video for a couple of minutes to consider those. Let's have a look at Rocket's statement. He said he has made halves because he split that into 2 parts. I would agree he has split it into 2 parts, but has he made halves? Each of those parts are a different size, so I would disagree in this case. He's not made halves. What about Peter? Peter has split the bar into 4 parts. Are those parts equal? They're not the same shape, but are they the same size? And in this case, yes, actually each of those parts are the same size. So I would agree that Peter has split those into quarters. And finally, Gamora. Gamora thinks she's made eighths because she split that pizza into 8 parts. And while I agree that is 8 parts, those parts are not equal, so we cannot call those eighths. Now I'd like you to consider the following. Here's Drax, and Drax has a sandwich, and he's going to cut that sandwich into 2 equal parts, and he's going to give one of those equal parts to Yondu. Now he's going to get another sandwich exactly the same as the first sandwich. He's going to split that into 2 equal parts once again, and he's going to give one of those parts to Mantis. And what I'd like you to consider is, whose share would you rather have? So I'd like you to pause the video once again and discuss with a partner which of those parts would you rather have. Now I want you to justify, so I want you to give a reason why you think the way you do. Let's consider again what we did there. Drax started with a sandwich, he split it into 2 equal parts, and he gave one of those parts to Yondu. He took another sandwich exactly the same size, he split that into 2 equal parts, and he gave one of those parts to Mantis. Each of those parts look different, and very often when I ask this question, a lot of people say, well, I'd rather have the part that Mantis had because that looks bigger. And some people say, well, I'd rather have the part that Yondu has because that looks bigger. In actual fact, both of those parts are exactly the same. He took that sandwich, he split it into 2 equal parts, so he made halves. So he gave Yondu half and he gave Mantis a half. And to prove that, let's get rid of the sandwich and replace this with a square. So that square there represents the sandwich. He gave a rectangular half to Yondu and a triangular half to Mantis. If we compare those, they might look different, but let's see what happens when we cut that triangular sandwich there. We've still got exactly the same size, but you can see now I've split that into 2 smaller parts. And if I take that smaller part, I turn that round and we join it there, you can see that those sandwiches are exactly the same size. So what does that tell us? It tells us that when it comes to fractions, the shape isn't important. What's important is that they're exactly the same size. It's time to get investigating with a partner. Here we've got Groot, and Groot has 6 strips of paper, and he's trying to fold them to make perfect halves, thirds, quarters, fifths, sixths, and eighths. Can you help him? So you're going to need some paper, or you can use strips of paper just like Groot has, or you might even use Post-its. And what I'd like you to do is, can you fold those in order to make those fractions? Now we've got Rocket, and Rocket has a strip of paper also. He only needs 3/4 of it. Can you help him? So once again, you might want to use an A4 piece of paper. You might want to use a strip of paper just like the one Rocket has, or you can use a post-it. And can you cut that so that you've only got 3/4 of it remaining? So once again, I'd like you to pause the video for 8 to 10 minutes, use the resources, and can you make those fractions? Now remember, when we make fractions, those parts have to be equal. So can you make each of those fractions accurately? I wonder how you got on with that. Some of those were easier to make than others. Let's start by trying to make halves. Now for halves, I can take a piece of paper, I can fold it over so that the corners meet exactly. I then made 2 equal parts, and there are my halves. And I can double check that by folding it over and double checking that the corners meet. Let's try quarters. Now I'm going to start by folding from one end. There's 1 fold, 2 folds, and 3 folds. When I unfold that, I've got 4 parts, but you can see they're not the same size, so they are not quarters. Let's try that again. This time I'm going to take a piece of paper and I'm going to start by making halves. And once I've made my halves, I can half my halves. And you can see there I've made perfect quarters. Each of those parts are exactly the same size. I'm going to make eighths next because I can use those halves and quarters to help me. I'm going to start by making halves. I'm going to half those again to make quarters. And when I half those, I've then made eighths. And if I unfold that piece of paper, you can see I've made perfect eighths. Let's try making thirds next. Now for thirds, I cannot start by making halves. That's not going to help me this time, so I'm going to have to use judgment. Here I'm going to fold once, and then I'm going to fold a second time so that I've made my 3 parts, but you can see those parts don't look equal. I'll fold it over just to double check, and yes, they're not equal. So thirds are very tricky to make. Let's try sixths this time, and sixths are tricky also, but we can start by attempting thirds. So let's try and make a better attempt at thirds this time. Folded it once and twice to make 3 parts. Let's check if these are better than last time. And not quite thirds, but a better attempt. However, with our attempted thirds, when we fold that in half, we've now made 6 parts. So we can make sixths by making thirds and then halving them. Finally, let's try making fifths, and I'm afraid once again trying to half to begin with isn't going to help us, so we're going to use judgment again. I'm going to fold it over once, then again, and then a 4th fold, and when I unfold that you can see I've got 5 parts, but unfortunately once again I've failed to make them accurately because fifths are really tricky to make. To begin with, I made halves, and when I made halves that was quite easy. I was able to fold the piece of paper into 2 equal parts to make my halves. I can then call them halves because they're exactly the same size. Thirds were a bit trickier. When I tried to make thirds, I struggled to make them the same size, so I couldn't technically call them thirds. So here's a better example. Here, I make thirds by splitting it into 3 equal parts. Now I can call them thirds. Quarters weren't too tricky at all. When I made quarters, I halved the piece of paper to begin with, then I halved those halves, and I made 4 equal parts, so I could call those quarters. Now when it came to fifths, they were really tricky because I wasn't able to use an easier fraction to help me. So my attempt was pretty poor. I made 5 parts, but they weren't equal, so I couldn't call them fifths. Here you can see I've split this blue piece of paper into 5 equal parts, so here we have fifths. Sixths were pretty tricky, but I could use another fraction to help me. I started by making thirds, or an attempt at thirds, and once I'd made those, I could half those thirds. When I half the thirds, I've made 6 parts. Now my parts weren't exactly equal, so I couldn't call them sixths. But here you can see I've split this yellow strip exactly into 6 equal parts, so we can call those sixths. And finally, we've got eighths here. Once again, eighths were relatively easy because I was able to use other fractions to help me. I started by making halves, then I halved those halves to make quarters, and I halved those to make my eighths. Those parts were equal, so we could call them eighths. For Rocket, we had a slightly different challenge. We weren't just interested in making quarters for Rocket, we were interested in making 3/4. So here we've got the strip of paper that he started with, and we can make quarters. So let's half that piece of paper to make 2 equal parts. We've made halves. Let's half those to make 4 equal parts. So now we've got quarters. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to name each of those parts. I'm going to call each of those 1/4. So you can see I've written that in each of those. Now that's really important, and I'll explain why. Now we've got 4/4 there. We split that whole into 4 equal parts. We've got 4/4. We don't need all of those 4/4, so we're going to get rid of one of those. We're going to cut one away in order that we've got our 3/4 left. So you can see there we've got exactly 3/4. Now it's really important that we name those parts, because quite often when we cut that quarter away and we're left with 3 equal parts like we have here, lots of people then think there's 3 equal parts, so they must be thirds. But each of those parts are a quarter of the original piece of paper that Rocket started with. They were quarters when we split them into 4 parts. They have not changed into thirds simply by taking one of those quarters away. They are still 3/4. Some of those fractions were easier to make than others. Halves were easy to make. Quarters were easy to make because we could half and half again. Eighths were easy to make because we could half again to make quarters, and half those quarters to make eighths. Thirds were trickier to make because we couldn't start with our easy halves to begin with. We had to try and estimate a third of the way along that piece of paper, fold it, and then try fold again. And I struggled with my attempt to make equal parts, so I couldn't make thirds. Sixths were just as tricky, but if I can make thirds, I can half those thirds to make sixths. And finally, fifths were the most difficult because I couldn't use any other fraction to start with to make it easy to fold those into 5 equal parts. Is there a way that we can make any fraction easily so each of the parts are equal and we can call them thirds, fifths, sixths, and so on? Now for this you're going to need a sheet of A4 paper, a ruler, and a pencil. Let's take the sheet of paper, and we're going to take that ruler and we're going to lay it across the top edge, and I'm going to draw a line right across there. Then I'm going to move that ruler down in line with that line I've just drawn, and I'm going to draw another line. And I'm going to do that again, and again, and I'm going to repeat that all the way down the page. Once I've done that, I'm going to number those lines. My first line I'm going to call 0, that's going to be our starting point each time. I draw 9 lines in total, which I've numbered from 0 to 8. Now I'm going to take a strip of paper, I'm going to take the top left corner of that strip of paper and lay it on the line that says 0. Then I'm going to take the top right corner of that strip of paper and I'm going to lay it exactly on the line that says 2. Where that crosses the number 1 line, I'm going to mark that, and that line is exactly halfway between each of those sides. So I've made perfect halves. Let's try quarters. Once again, I'm going to line that up so that the top left corner is on the 0 line, the top right corner is on the 4 line, and I'm going to mark exactly where it crosses each of the lines in between. I've made 3 marks. I can take a ruler to draw a line across the strip of paper, and I have made perfect quarters. Now you can repeat that for thirds, fifths, sixths, and eighths. You can make any fraction you like using this method. Once I've done that, I'm going to name each of those parts because that's going to be really important if we want to make, for example, 3/4 or 2/5 or 5/6 and so on. I don't need to use this method to make halves, quarters and eighths. I could make those easily by folding them exactly. We can make those really tricky fractions like thirds, fifths, sixths, and so on that we struggle to do by folding, we can use this strategy to make accurate fractions. It's time to discuss our success criteria, so pause the video for a couple of minutes, and with a partner, I want you to discuss how you can make any fraction. So for example, if I wanted to make 5/8, what would the steps be that I would have to go through in order to make that accurately? So how do we make any fraction? I'm going to use a bar to represent that strip of paper that we used before, and let's consider what we need to do to make 5/8. Well, to begin with, we need to start with the whole amount. We start with that whole strip, we start with the whole bar. And the next thing we need to do is decide how many parts we're going to split that into. Now, the fraction name will tell you, and in this case, the name of the fraction we're interested in is eighths. The 5 doesn't tell us the name of the fraction, the 5 just tells us how many of those parts we want. The next thing we need to do is split it into equal parts. Now, we can use the method that I showed you before, but we only really need to do that for those trickier fractions to make. We're interested in eighths here, and we found a way of making eighths easily. We did that by halving the strip to begin with, halving those halves to make quarters, and finally halving each of those quarters to make our eighths. The next thing we're going to do is name each of those equal parts. I've split this bar into 8 parts, so I'm going to name each of those parts 1/8. Now, I know this is going to take us a little bit longer to do, but it's really important to help us understand the fraction that we're making. The last thing we need to do is cut out the parts we need. We're interested in 5 of those eighths, so we can get rid of 3 of them to leave us with our 5/8. It's time to try that out. Here we've got our 3 Guardians again, and each of them start with 3 protein bars. They've got a lemon, an apple, and a cherry flavour. Each of them eat some of each flavour. So we can see here that Rocket is left with 1/2 of his lemon bar, Peter is left with 1/4 of his lemon bar, and Gamora is left with 1/8 of her lemon bar. Then they eat the apple bar. Rocket is left with 3/4, Peter is left with 1/3, and Gamora is left with 4/8. And finally, they eat some of the cherry bar. Rocket is left with 5/8, Peter is left with 2/3, and Gamora is left with 5/6. Now, what I'd like you to do is use paper strips again, or A4 sheets of paper, or even post-its, and I want you to create each of the bars they have left. So, if you want to go for the mild challenge this week, I want you to make the lemon bars, so you're making 1/2, 1/4, and 1/8. If you're going for the spicy challenge, I want you to make the apple bars that they've got left, so you're making 3/4, 1/3, and 4/8. And if you're going for the extra hot challenge, then you're going to make those cherry bars that are remaining. So I want you to make 5/8, 2/3, and 5/6. Pause the video for 10 minutes or so and use the strategies that we've looked at today in order to make accurate fractions. Once you've done that, I then want you to consider what fraction of each bar have they actually eaten. So what's the part that you've taken away? And if you manage all of that, why don't you have a go at making other fractions? Can you make more difficult fractions, like 4/7? How many different fractions can you create using those strategies? It's time to reflect on what we've learned today, so once again I want you to pause the video for a few minutes, and with a partner I want you to discuss the following questions. What have you learned today? What did you find easy or difficult? Did you get stuck? What helped you when something got tricky? What do you need more help with? What is really making you think? And what are your next steps? The last thing I'm going to ask you to do today is, can you apply what we've learned? So as a class, I'd like you to discuss and solve the following problems. So here's Peter, and he's been doing a bit of painting, and it says, Peter is painting different options for a new Guardians flag. What fraction of each flag has he painted? You might notice that for some of these flags, the parts are not the same size. So you might have to consider, is there a way of making them equal in order that we can name those fractions? Once you've done that, you can then discuss the following. He's used exactly the same amount of paint on 2 of those flags. Can you spot which ones? Thanks for joining me again today. I hope you enjoyed that. Remember, you can contact me at scott.morrow@southayrshire.gov.uk if you've got any questions about today's lesson. You can follow me on Twitter at scottmorrowsa, where you can find my weekly Friday Maths challenges, and you'll find all my videos available at Scott Morrow Maths on YouTube. Next week, we're going to continue looking at fractions where we'll be exploring equivalent fractions. I hope you join me then.